Well, good evening. It's so good to see everyone here tonight, and welcome to those who are joining us online. I hope everybody is doing okay. Survived the storms last night, and it's raining outside now, but not nearly what they were saying. I don't know if I don't know if those big storms dissipated or whether the next wave is coming in. It's supposed to be wet all the way through to tomorrow, but you never know. We'll see what we'll see what happens. I do have a swimming pool in my front yard, courtesy of the city of Beaumont. Dug a big hole in my front yard, and now it's full of water. And so, but that's not what we're here to talk about tonight. And if you have your Bible, you can go ahead and turn to Nehemiah chapter 5. And we'll be looking at Nehemiah chapter 5 tonight and reflecting back on last week. So Nehemiah got one set of problems dealt with, issues of discouragement, issues of opposition, and different things. And so Nehemiah addressed those issues, only to be faced with a new set of issues in chapter 5. And we're not sure if the people actually went on strike, but they definitely had some complaints. They definitely had some issues that needed to be dealt with. So let's pick up in Nehemiah chapter 5 there in verse 1. There was a widespread outcry from the people and their wives against their Jewish countrymen. So it's one thing for the men to be upset, but when the wives are upset, then you've got a whole new level of problems on your hands. And so it's very interesting that he says there was widespread outcry from the people and their wives against their Jewish countrymen. So there was conflict between the Jewish people who were residing there in Jerusalem. Well, why was there conflict? Well, one, there was a shortage of food. Some were saying, "We, our sons and our daughters, are numerous. Let us get grain so that we can eat and live." So there was a shortage of food. Now, we'll see in verse 3 that one of the reasons there was a shortage of food is there was a famine. But what was everybody doing? Everybody was working on the wall. Most everybody was working on the wall, so they weren't tending their crops. They weren't harvesting their crops. They weren't bringing in food because everybody was working on the wall. So there was a shortage of food. And for those who had food and were willing to sell it, the cost of that food was excessive. In verse 3 it says, "Others were saying, 'We are mortgaging our fields, our vineyards, and homes to get grain during the famine.'" Can you imagine having to mortgage your home just to be able to feed your family? So they were not only having to pay for food, but those who had food were taking advantage of the situation, and they were charging excessive prices for that food. We're mortgaging everything that we have in order to feed our families. And not only were they having to buy food, but it tells us in verse 4, still others were saying, "We have borrowed money to pay the king's tax on our fields and vineyards." And so if you owned property, you were having to pay the king's tax. Probably even if you didn't own property, you were having to pay taxes to King Artaxerxes. And what do we know about those who collected the tax? Typically, they didn't only just collect what the king was asking for. Usually, they weren't very reputable people, and they were taxing you more than what they should have been. So there was a shortage of food. You were having to pay exorbitant prices to get food. And then on top of that, you were having to pay taxes to the king. And so there were all of these problems, and the people of Jerusalem were in an uproar. And then, to make matters worse, in verse 5, we see, we and our children are just like our countrymen and their children, yet we are subjecting our sons and daughters to slavery. Some of our daughters are already enslaved, but we are powerless because our fields and vineyards belong to other people. So, if you didn't have a home to mortgage, if you'd already given away your field, if you'd already given away your vineyard, well, what's next? Okay, well, I'm going to sell my child into slavery, or I will indenture my child to this fellow Jew who will then pay me for that, and then I'll be able to feed my family, or I'll be able to pay my taxes. But the problem was then those Jewish people were then selling their countrymen to foreigners. They were taking those indentured servants, and then they were turning around and selling them and making more money off of their countrymen. And so there were all of these problems, there were all of these social issues that were taking place between these fellow Jewish neighbors. And we know from earlier Old Testament scriptures in Deuteronomy and during the Exodus and stuff that God had laid down laws that these types of things should not have been happening. Jewish brothers and sisters should not have been treating one another in this way. And so they were breaking God's law. And so we see there in chapter 5, verse 6, Nehemiah's initial reaction. Once he had heard this, I became extremely angry when I heard their outcry and these complaints. So Nehemiah's initial reaction to this was he became extremely angry. Now, fortunately, we see there in the next verse that he doesn't act out of that initial reaction. You know, sometimes when we face a problem, we can have that initial reaction of anger, and we can respond or react out of that anger, and a lot of times it is not the right response, or it is not the right reaction. We cause more problems than we solve. You know, when we react or when we respond out of our anger. I can look back over my life and I can reflect on times, or Satan has no problem reminding me of times of when I have responded or I have reacted out of anger. And I have to just kind of hang my head and shake my head, and it's like, oh goodness, I hope nobody else remembers that. You know, because it can lead to some embarrassing moments. So, but Nehemiah doesn't respond or react out of his anger. No, in verse 7 it says, after seriously considering the matter. So now it doesn't say specifically here that Nehemiah prayed about the matter, but we know that Nehemiah was a man of prayer. So after seriously considering the matter, so I am sure he sought God about what to do. He prayed about this and thought, what can we do to solve the issue? So, continuing in verse 7, Nehemiah writes, I accused the nobles and officials, saying to them, each of you is charging his countrymen interest. Problem number one. Against God's law, number one, charging their fellow Jewish brothers and sisters interest. So I called a large assembly against them and said, we have done our best to buy back our Jewish countrymen who were sold to foreigners, but now you sell your own countrymen, and we have to buy them back. Problem number two, you're selling your fellow Jews into foreign slavery. Another no-no according to God's law. They remained silent and could not say a word. They knew they were guilty. They knew that what they were doing was wrong. Then I said, what you are doing isn't right. Just in case they didn't figure it out, Nehemiah is going to tell them, what you're doing is not right. Shouldn't you walk in the fear of our God and not invite the reproach of our foreign enemies? So one, you're not walking according to God's laws, and you should be. And secondly, our enemies, these men who are against us, these people who are against us, they're looking at us and seeing how we're treating one another. And they probably don't even treat their own people the way that we are treating one another in these situations. So he says, shouldn't you walk in the way of our God and not invite the reproach of our foreign enemies? So he identifies the problem to them. And of course, they knew what they were doing was wrong. They knew that they shouldn't have been treating their fellow Jewish brothers and sisters in this way. And so he identifies the problem to them, and then he goes about bringing it to a stop. In verse 10, he says, even I, as well as my brothers and my servants, have been lending them money and grain. Please, let's stop charging this interest. So he says, stop it. Stop charging your neighbor's interest. I've been loaning them money, I've been loaning them food, and I'm not charging them interest, and you need to stop charging them interest as well. So he identifies the problem to them, and then he tells them, this has got to stop. We need to put an end to this. And then he says, we need to correct this problem. We need to bring a resolution to what's taking place. So in verse 11, he says, return their fields, vineyards, olive groves, and houses to them immediately, along with the percentage of the money, grain, new wine, and fresh oil that you have been assessing them. So he says, this is how we're going to resolve this problem. This is how we're going to correct this issue. Not only are you going to stop charging them interest, but you're going to return to them their fields and their vineyards and their olive groves and houses to them when? Tomorrow? Next week? No, immediately. You're going to do this now. You're going to do this immediately. Along with the percentage of the money, grain, new wine, and fresh oil that you have been assessing them. So you're not only going to return to them their property, but you're going to return to them the interest that you have been charging them. Now think about that as a businessman. Ouch. So I not only have to give back what I took from them, but the interest that they've paid on the money that I've loaned them, I've got to pay that back as well. I hope they hadn't already spent it. You know, because that could dig deep into the pocket. And Nehemiah says, not only are you going to do that, but you're going to do it immediately. How many times do we have good intentions, or we set out to do what is right, and it's like, I can start that tomorrow. You know, tomorrow is always a great time to start something. Only problem is tomorrow never comes, or I can do that next week. And so we get convicted about something, we're going to make that change, and then we wind up not making it. And Nehemiah says, you're going to do this immediately. You're going to do this right now. And so the people respond to Nehemiah. the nobles and all of those people that he had gathered together so he could share with them what they were doing wrong, they responded there in verse 12, "We will return these things and require nothing more from them. We will do as you say." So they're agreeing with Nehemiah. They have been convicted of what they were doing wrong, and they agree with Nehemiah. Well, it's one thing to say something, it's another thing to actually do it. And Nehemiah knew that. So he didn't let them off the hook by just agreeing with what they said they would do. No, he goes a step further. So the people have agreed with me, so I summoned the priest and made everyone take an oath to do this. So, okay, not only are you going to agree with me, but you're going to make an oath in front of the priest. You're going to make an oath in the presence of God that you're going to do what you have agreed to do. It's kind of like cross your heart, hope to die, whatever it is, spit in your eye, You're going to make an oath to God that you're going to do what you say you're going to do. And then he takes it a step further. I also shook the folds of my robe and said, "May God likewise shake from his house and property everyone who doesn't keep this promise. May he be shaken out and have nothing." The whole assembly said, "Amen," and praised the Lord. Then the people did as they had promised. And so the people follow through on their promise. But Nehemiah doesn't just make them take an oath, but he puts a little symbolism with them. And he takes his robe and he shakes the dust out of his robe. And he says, if you don't keep your promise, may God do the same thing to you. May he shake you out of the family of God, and may you be left with nothing. And so he told them, this is how serious this is. You're not just making an oath to these people, and you're not just making an oath to keep your promise, but you are making an oath before God that you're going to follow his ways. And if you don't, I'm going to pray that God's consequences fall upon you. And so the people see how serious Nehemiah has taken what has happened. And they agree with him and they follow through on it. Then the people did as they had promised. And so all of these fields, all of these vineyards, all of these homes that had been taken away from their fellow countrymen were returned with interest. And the people were restored to their rightful place. And so as we move into the next part of this chapter, it's almost like it doesn't fit. It's like, okay, wait a minute, where is he going with this? But commentators believe, and I agree with them, that this next section, Nehemiah backs up what he has asked of these fellow Jewish people. He said, I want you to see the example that I am setting for you. I'm asking you not to take advantage of your neighbors, and I'm going to show you how I have done the same thing. I want to give you an example. I want to show you how I have done the same thing that I'm asking you to do. So it's not like Nehemiah is standing up here and asking them to do something that he's not willing to do himself. And so we pick up there in verse 14 where Nehemiah says, "Furthermore, from the day King Artaxerxes appointed me to be their governor in the land of Judah, from the 20th year until his 32nd year, 12 years, I and my associates never ate from the food allotted to the governor." So we see here that Nehemiah, in that first year that he was back in the city of Jerusalem, had been appointed governor over the nation of Israel. Now, this is a high and important position. Some people think that this takes place after the wall is completed, but Scripture will show us that that's not true, that it takes place while the wall is still being built, and Artaxerxes, places him as governor. Well, when you have position, with position comes certain privileges. And one of those privileges is that the governor was provided with food. He had an allotment of food. Well, who do you think that food came from? Well, that food came from the people that you were ruling over. And so Nehemiah tells us here, I and my associates never ate from the food allotted to the governor. So even though he was the governor, even though he had certain privileges, he did not take advantage of them, because he knew that would be taking advantage of those that he ruled over. The same people he was telling these noblemen not to take advantage of, what would it look like if he was taking advantage of them and taking food out of their mouths, taking wine out of their vineyards, taking money out of their pockets? And so he said, we did not take advantage of this privilege. And so many times when you're in a certain level of position, there are privileges that come with it. There are also temptations that come with it to take advantage of certain situations. And Nehemiah is saying, just because I am in this position, I'm not going to succumb to those temptations. I'm not going to succumb to those privileges. Nehemiah also wanted to show them that he was going to do things the right way. The governors who preceded me had heavily burdened the people, taking from them food and wine as well as a pound of silver. Their subordinates also oppressed the people, but because of the fear of God, I didn't do this. So Nehemiah is saying, here is how the old governors operated. Here's how the old governors took advantage of the people. And I want you to know I'm going to do things in a different way. I'm going to do things the right way. And so he says, I did not operate the same way the old governors operated, because that would have been wrong. Next, Nehemiah didn't focus on new agendas, but he stayed focused on what he was there to do. And what was he there to do? He was there to build a wall. And so it tells us in verse 16, instead, I devoted myself to the construction of this wall, and all of my subordinates were gathered there for the work. So, can you picture a governor being in place and he's saying, hey, I've got position now. There's things that I can make happen. They may not be what the king wants to make happen. They may not be what's right that needs to happen, but I've got some ideas of myself. I could build myself a nice little nest egg here. I could build myself a nice little kingdom here. And so they start to put into place their own agendas. But Nehemiah said, I'm not going to do that. I'm here for one purpose and for one purpose only, and that is to get this wall built. And so he focused on the agenda that God had sent him there for, and that was to build that wall. He didn't start coming up with all other kinds of projects and all other kinds of agendas, but he focused on what God had called him to do. And then finally, we see again that Nehemiah did not take advantage of the position that he was in. Wrapping up there in verse 16, he says, "We didn't buy any land." Well, you might be thinking, okay, well, what would be wrong with buying some land? Well, I think what it's referring to here is you could probably get a pretty good deal on some land. Because think about the situation that the people were in. You know, they were in need of food, they were in need of money, and you could probably take advantage of somebody and maybe pay them half of what the property was really worth, if that person was really desperate enough. So Nehemiah is saying, we didn't buy any land. We didn't take advantage of the situation and get a good deal. And then following up in verse 17, now imagine this. This is something hard for me to wrap my head around. There were 150 Jews and officials as well as guests from the surrounding nations at my table, and each day, 1 ox, 6 choice sheep, and some fowl were prepared for me. An abundance of all kinds of wine was provided every 10 days. But I did not demand the food allotted to the governor because the burden on the people was so heavy. So Nehemiah is saying, this came out of my own pocket. This came out of my own stock, out of my own herd. But can you imagine feeding 150 people every day? Being responsible to feed that many people every day. And then just start doing the math. Just on 5 days, and that's because that makes it easier on me to figure up the math. So you're talking in a 5-day period, 5 oxen, 30 sheep. 30 sheep. And then he says some fowl, you just kind of have to guesstimate there. So that was prepared every day, for these guests and for these administrators and things that were eating at Nehemiah's table. And he did not take advantage of the food that was allotted for the governor, but this came out of his own pocket. This came out of his own possessions. That's got to be a pretty big flock of sheep and a large number of oxen. But I didn't demand the food allotted to the governor because the burden on the people was so heavy. So he realized the burden that was already on the Jewish people. And he wasn't going to add to that burden just because he could. But he wanted them to know, I see the situation that you're in, and I'm not going to make it worse. And then Nehemiah wraps up this chapter by saying, remember me favorably, my God, for all that I have done for this people. And so you might look at that and say, well, Nehemiah, he's just wanting God to, he's just being a good guy so that God will, reward him and, he'll get richer. Well, no, he's praying God, I want you to know that I am trying to live by your word. I want you to know that I'm trying to do things that are right. And that you would look upon me favorably because of that. I'm not doing it so that you will bless me, but because I am doing it, fulfill your promises to me. And so Nehemiah addresses those issues that he faced in chapter 4. He finds a whole new set of issues in chapter 5, and he addresses those. And he continues to lead the Jewish people in this process of rebuilding the wall. And so that concludes chapter 5. Now remember, tonight was the last Wednesday night supper. But we're going to continue to meet on Wednesday nights at 6 o'clock. We're going to continue to complete the book of Nehemiah. So have dinner and then come join us at 6 o'clock, and we'll continue this until we finish the book of Nehemiah. And then we'll take a little break because in July we're going to do in-home Bible studies on Sunday evenings. If you remember, we've done in-home Bible studies in the summer before. And it's just a great time to have a time of fellowship and Bible study in a different setting. That it's not taking place of Sunday morning. It's in addition to Sunday morning. And so we're going to be doing that in July. So during that time, we'll take a little break on Wednesday nights before we pick up back in the fall. Can you believe we're already talking about the fall? And so June is right upon us. So I look forward to seeing you next Wednesday night. Hope that you have a great rest of your week. Stay dry, and look forward to seeing you on Sunday. Good night.